It was a still and cloudless morning when the housekeeper at Rosewell Grange let out a sharp cry that shattered the calm like a dropped plate. Her voice carried up the stone stairwell and down the panelled halls, drawing the gardener from the greenhouse and the cook from her bread dough. They found her on the threshold of Mr. Lionel Spence's private study, a large wood-panelled room with a writing desk facing the bay window and a grandfather clock that ticked with imperious precision. Mr. Spence, the owner of the estate and a retired solicitor of considerable repute, was slumped forward in the leather-backed chair, head resting on his arms atop the blotter. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no broken glass or torn papers, just an untouched cup of tea to his left, and most curiously, a closed leather-bound diary lying to his right, entirely blank from cover to cover. The police arrived within the hour, along with the family physician, who pronounced the cause of death as heart failure, though he admitted the timing was strange. Lionel had no serious medical history and had been laughing over brandy with his nephew the night before. Superintendent Herrick, a stout man with a greying moustache and little patience for ambiguity, concluded it must have been natural causes. But it was the diary that puzzled him. According to the housekeeper, it had been the one Lionel kept meticulously, never missing a day in 20 years. He wrote in it nightly at precisely 10 o'clock, recording everything from weather to family, squabbles and legal consultations. Yet this diary was empty, not torn out, not replaced, but genuinely blank, as if he had never used it. His last year's diary was full, sitting neatly on the second shelf. Why this one, just 6 months into the year, showed no entries at all was beyond sense. Stranger still, the ink bottle beside it was dry as bone. The family gathered at the Grange the next day, each as baffled as the other. There was his nephew, Miles Spence, a strapping fellow with a red face and a bluff manner, currently employed with an engineering firm in Leeds. His wife, Claire, slim and soft-spoken, kept mostly to the drawing room. Then there was Lionel's sister, Mrs. Agatha Merriweather, a widow with sharp opinions and a fondness for control. She seemed most perturbed that her brother's death might cast a shadow over her garden luncheon planned for the following weekend. But it was the arrival of Miss Jane Marple that changed the air of the household entirely. She came at Claire's request, an old acquaintance from a Women's Institute gathering years ago. Miss Marple, with her gentle eyes and silver hair tucked under a lavender hat, was not the sort to provoke alarm, but something in her quiet questions made even Superintendent Herrick pause. She examined the study the moment she arrived, taking her time. Her gaze lingered on the tidy papers, the inkless bottle, the closed diary. She asked the housekeeper whether Lionel had ever dictated his entries. "Oh no, miss. Mr. Spence always wrote by hand. Wouldn't have anyone touch his things." She asked Claire whether Lionel had seemed distressed lately. No, if anything, he was more cheerful than usual. He said he was finally putting something behind him. And she asked the cook whether any guests had come by in the past fortnight. Only the postman, and once a gentleman in a grey hat. Said he was an old colleague. Mr. Spence sent him away at the door, looked a bit shaken afterward. At the funeral, held in the village church beneath a leaden sky, Miss Marple stood quietly apart. She noticed that Claire cried silently, Miles did not cry at all, and Agatha Merriweather seemed most anxious about the press coverage. Back at the Grange, Miss Marple requested to see Lionel's previous diaries. They were arranged on a shelf, by year. She selected the most recent, last year's, and thumbed through the pages. Her eyes narrowed. The writing was neat, compact, and methodical. But something caught her attention in the final entries. Mentions of meetings with someone named R, notes on duplicate papers, and then, abruptly, in the final week. Decision made. Claire must not know. She returned to the present year's diary, the blank one. She ran her fingers over the pages, paused, and then held it to the light. There, faintly, like the ghost of a pen, were indentations. Someone had written in it, but the ink was gone. She requested a pencil and lightly shaded over one of the pages. Words began to emerge, fragmented, partial. Miles. Not to be trusted. Will read Claire in soon. Check papers in drawer. The drawer was locked, but Miss Marple inquired, delicately, whether Lionel had left a will. Miles said yes, of course, and the solicitor had it, but Miss Marple was not asking about that. Oh, you mean like instructions? Well, he had an old safe in the library behind the Sir Joshua Reynolds painting, but I don't think anyone's used it in years. The safe was still locked when the superintendent came to open it. Inside were 3 envelopes, one addressed to Claire, one to the family solicitor, and one with no name. The one with no name contained a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten. It said simply, "If I am found dead, look to the ink." The bottle on Lionel's desk, when tested, was not merely dry. It had contained a chemical compound used to erase ink permanently on contact. It could have been poured in earlier, weeks before. He may have written his diary every night, never knowing the ink was vanishing. But who would do such a thing? And why? Miss Marple looked across the parlour at the family. Miles avoided her gaze. Claire looked stunned, and Agatha Merriweather had gone uncharacteristically pale. The question was no longer whether Lionel had died of natural causes. The question now was, who had made certain his records vanished with him? And what truth did he try to preserve, believing it would one day be read? Miss Marple folded the blank diary gently and murmured, "I think perhaps the crime was far from simple. In fact, it may be the cleverest I've ever seen." Miss Marple remained seated in the drawing-room long after the others had dispersed, her hands folded neatly over her handbag, eyes fixed thoughtfully on the fire's low glow. The crackling of the logs seemed to echo the silent stirrings of logic forming in her mind. She was not one to make accusations, nor to rush with conclusions, but already the faintest threads of unease had begun to tighten around a few details that seemed too carefully placed, too convenient. That diary, blank, yet with evidence of written indentations and an ink bottle contaminated with a chemical designed to erase, it suggested planning, not panic. And that level of forethought indicated something far deeper than a chance quarrel or sudden greed. Someone had been erasing a man long before his death was discovered. Superintendent Herrick was not pleased to find her still there when he returned the following afternoon. He made no secret of his irritation, huffing into the room with the stiffness of a man who disliked interference. "Afternoon, Miss Marple. I should think this matter is wrapped up. Nothing suspicious in the autopsy, and the solicitors confirmed the will hasn't changed in 3 years. His nephew Miles gets the house. Claire inherits some bonds. The sister gets a trust fund. Nothing to dispute, really." Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. "And yet," she said softly, "you must admit, Superintendent, that the blank diary is unusual." Herrick grunted. "More eccentricity than evidence, I'd say. Perhaps he imagined he was writing, or meant to write but never did. The mind plays tricks at his age." "Indeed it can," she replied calmly. "Although I wonder how often the mind tricks itself into unlocking a drawer and storing documents in a hidden safe, then composing farewell letters." Herrick shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that she was drawing attention to things he had noted but dismissed. "We'll send that ink bottle for further testing, if that satisfies." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Of course, Superintendent. But while we wait, might I ask a question?" Herrick blinked. "You usually do." "If Lionel Spence wrote in his diary nightly, and those entries were made in good faith, yet none remain, would it not follow that someone near to him had reason to ensure those thoughts disappeared?" "Who would go to such trouble?" he asked, half annoyed, half intrigued despite himself. That's just it, she said, tapping her chin lightly. It would have to be someone who knew when he wrote, had access to his desk, and knew precisely what was in that diary, which raises another thought. How did the person know there was something worth erasing? He didn't respond, but the silence was telling. Miss Marple rose and asked whether she might borrow a copy of Lionel's previous diaries for the evening. Herrick allowed it with a muttered warning not to go stirring the pot. By twilight, she had returned to her guest room and begun comparing last year's entries with the one that had been tampered with. Patterns emerged. Lionel had mentioned appointments with someone referred to as R, a project involving the Leeds property and frequent concerns about his nephew's debt. She read slowly, noting tone, phrasing, careful entries about things best not spoken aloud. Then one peculiar detail leapt out. On 3 separate dates, Lionel noted that Claire had brought him tea and stayed to chat, each time followed by a mention of feeling unwell, a headache, or unusual fatigue. And curiously, no mention of Claire in the new year, until the final shaded impression in the blank diary, "Will read Claire in soon." The next morning, Miss Marple requested a brief word with Claire. They walked through the garden in coats, wind brushing lightly through the hedgerows. Miss Marple remarked on the house's symmetry, how it reminded her of her cousin Mildred's home in Norfolk. Then, very gently, she said, "Claire, you were fond of Lionel, weren't you?" "Yes," Claire said softly, eyes on the path. "He was always kind to me. He never made me feel small." "Even when your husband borrowed money from him?" Miss Marple asked kindly, as if it were the most natural thing. Claire blinked. "He told you?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but he recorded it." Claire swallowed hard. "I didn't know that. I assumed it was all forgiven." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Forgiven, perhaps. Forgotten, unlikely. But what interests me is that Lionel noted feeling ill after drinking tea on 3 occasions, each time shortly after conversations with you. And then, abruptly, he ceased writing about you at all." Claire stopped walking. "Are you saying I poisoned him?" "I'm not saying anything yet, my dear. I'm only wondering why a man would stop documenting interactions with someone he trusted, unless he had reason to doubt them." Claire looked away, eyes glistening. "I didn't hurt him. I was trying to help. He was so alone, even when others were around. I thought maybe I could get him to talk. But he wouldn't. Not really. Just said there were things I'll put right soon." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Claire's wrist. "Do you recall anyone else ever being present when he wrote his diary? Anyone lingering nearby?" Claire thought for a moment. "No. But now that you mention it, Miles once joked that Lionel should dictate to a secretary. He even offered to type up the old diaries to save space." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Type them?" "Yes, but Lionel refused. He said paper never lies." That afternoon, Miss Marple asked to see the household typewriter. It sat on a desk in the library, neatly covered, rarely used. She typed a few words herself, then compared them to the anonymous typed note in the safe. The letters matched, slightly misaligned, E's, a faint smudge near the T key. The note about the ink, typed, not handwritten, had come from this very machine. But Lionel had not typed anything in years. Everyone said so, which meant someone else had typed that note and placed it in the safe. Someone trying to make it look as if Lionel had left behind a message. Perhaps they knew his ink had been tampered with and tried to steer attention toward that clue. Or perhaps they hoped suspicion would stop there, conveniently short of discovering why he was silenced. As Miss Marple sat down once more with the blank diary, she noticed a thin slice of paper tucked between 2 pages, almost imperceptible. On it, scribbled hastily, were 2 words, "Not Miles." It was an odd note to leave, yet somehow it didn't exonerate, it complicated. Because if Lionel had felt compelled to deny one suspect by name, it meant he believed others would think Miles guilty. But what if that was the plan all along, not to avoid suspicion, but to divert it? Miss Marple sat very still. Somewhere in Rosewell Grange, the real hand behind the empty diary was watching, waiting, perhaps even smiling, certain they'd already won. But the edges of their deception were starting to fray. And Jane Marple, with her keen eyes and gentle manner, was beginning to pull at the thread. Miss Marple requested the family to gather once more in the drawing-room, suggesting, ever so politely, that it might be useful to speak openly as a group about the days leading up to Lionel's death. She seated herself unobtrusively near the hearth, knitting needles in hand, though the yarn never moved. Superintendent Herrick stood in the corner, arms folded, watching with a mix of tolerance and curiosity. Claire sat with her back straight, hands clasped in her lap. Miles slouched on the arm of a chair, arms crossed, while Agatha Merriweather perched near the window, her expression composed but tense as though enduring a long sermon. Miss Marple began gently. It seems Mr. Spence had grown rather concerned in the final weeks of his life. Not about illness, but something or someone that troubled his conscience. I wonder if any of you noticed a change in his behavior. Agatha sniffed. He was always serious, but the last fortnight he seemed distracted, kept fiddling with those infernal books of his. I assumed it was some legal matter. You know how men get in retirement. Old cases, half-forgotten regrets. Miles shrugged. He seemed fine to me. We had drinks 3 nights ago. Talked about Leeds, my job. He said he was thinking about updating the will. Not that it matters now. That drew a flicker of reaction from Claire. Just a quick tilt of her head, as though she'd heard something she hadn't expected. Miss Marple caught it. Did he say why he was updating it? She asked. Miles scratched his cheek. No, just that he'd been meaning to. Honestly, I don't think he'd actually done it. Did he mention anything else during that visit? Miles hesitated. Not really. Asked about our finances. That was awkward. I told him we were managing. Claire looked up then, voice quiet. We're not. And you didn't tell him the truth. Miles turned sharply. That's not relevant. But Miss Marple's voice was mild. Oh, I think it might be. You see, there's something quite particular about a man who begins to write farewell letters, locks them in a safe, and tries to leave behind evidence that's already being wiped away. It suggests he knew something was coming, or feared someone close to him did. Agatha cut in crisply. Miss Marple, forgive me, but I must say this is bordering on unkind. My brother had a weak heart, and now we're sitting about discussing motives as though we were in some third-rate novel. Miss Marple gave a slight smile. I assure you, Mrs. Merriweather, I have nothing but respect for the dead, which is why I find it rather telling that his diary, a lifetime habit, was rendered unreadable page by page with invisible ink. Agatha said nothing, but her mouth tightened. Claire cleared her throat. Lionel told me something strange. A few days before he died, he said he'd been betrayed once, years ago, and it had returned to haunt him. I asked what he meant, but he waved me off. Miss Marple turned to her. Did he say who betrayed him? No, but he seemed genuinely unsettled. He said he'd made a mistake, keeping someone in his confidence, that people reveal themselves sooner or later. Miles snorted. Sounds like the sort of melodrama he'd say after 2 sherries. Or the kind of thing a man says when he knows he's running out of time, Miss Marple replied gently. Tell me, Mr. Spence, did you ever see anyone else in Lionel's study? Anyone who might have known where he kept the safe? Miles blinked. No, just the housekeeper and Claire, I suppose. Agatha never went near his study. I never meddled. In his affairs, Agatha said quickly. Miss Marple turned her gaze on the older woman. And yet you seemed quite certain that this death was natural. You've been adamant from the beginning. Agatha's eyes narrowed. I've seen enough grief in my life to recognize when it's not worth picking apart. But Lionel's grief hadn't yet arrived, Miss Marple said quietly. And he was trying to protect someone. Perhaps not himself, but someone else. Maybe Claire, since she was mentioned in the last impression left in his diary. Or maybe he feared what would be revealed if he died with unfinished words. Herrick stepped forward at last. All right, that's enough speculation. Let's get back to facts. The ink was tampered with. The safe had letters. That's more than we had 2 days ago, so unless someone here wants to volunteer information, we'll proceed with interviews individually. Miss Marple held up a hand. May I suggest something, Superintendent? Not all deception lies in silence. Sometimes it lies in eagerness. She turned to Miles. You volunteered that Lionel wanted to update his will, but no one else had heard that, yet you offered it freely as though establishing your own narrative. Miles stiffened. I was telling the truth. And you may be, she replied. But then there's something odd about the timeline. Lionel wrote that he intended to read Claire in, implying she didn't yet know something. But Claire tells us Lionel confided in her days earlier, even hinting at betrayal. So either he changed his mind and never revealed it, or someone else tried to fill in the gaps after he was gone. Claire looked down. I didn't know about the safe until you mentioned it yesterday, and I've never seen that diary until the day he died. Miss Marple gave her a thoughtful glance. No. But someone knew exactly how to ensure the diary, said nothing, and someone else tried very hard to make sure a typed note pointed suspicion elsewhere. A typed note, I should mention, made using the house's own typewriter, despite Lionel only writing longhand. Miles spoke again, louder this time. Are you accusing me of faking that note? Why would I do that? Why would I type a warning? Perhaps because it makes you look like the one who discovered it, not the one who placed it. Miss Marple replied calmly. It's quite common for those who deceive to provide just enough truth to distract from the whole of it. Agatha shifted suddenly in her chair. I'm beginning to think Lionel suspected more than one person. Miss Marple turned to her. He may have, but he trusted someone enough to leave behind the truth, even if only in faint impressions. Herrick leaned forward. And we'll get to it, piece by piece. But Miss Marple already saw what others had missed. Not in confessions nor in lies, but in how each voice aligned just slightly off-center. Claire spoke quietly as though still waiting for permission to speak the whole truth. Miles defended with the confidence of someone rehearsed. And Agatha, the cool overseer, had offered no warmth toward her brother, only indignation at the questions. Each voice tried to pull the story in its own direction. But the truth, if she followed its quiet thread, was beginning to whisper from behind the fabric. And it was rarely the loudest voice that revealed it. The drawing room emptied slowly after the uncomfortable round of questioning, each family member drifting away under the weight of their own thoughts. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting untouched in her lap, her eyes quietly reflecting the tangle of motives that had begun to surface like weeds through the soil. It was no longer a question of whether Lionel Spence's death had been natural. It clearly had not. Now it was a matter of untangling which thread among the three led to the knot at the center. She began by revisiting the most direct motive: inheritance. Miles stood to gain the most. The estate, the house, even the residuals from Lionel's former legal partnerships, everything had been consolidated into a will that favored the nephew above all. But something in Miles's behavior didn't quite fit the mold of a man desperate for a quick reward. He hadn't pressed for probate. He hadn't inquired about bank accounts or shares. He'd been eager, yes, but more defensive than greedy. That in itself suggested he feared discovery more than he craved wealth. Claire's position was different. Her inheritance was modest, safe, respectful. But Miss Marple recalled something else, something not spoken, but implied. Claire had mentioned trying to get Lionel to talk, to open up. That didn't speak of avarice. It spoke of someone seeking protection, or perhaps absolution. Her reaction to Miles's financial lie had been genuine, and Miss Marple had seen guilt settle in her shoulders when the safe was mentioned. But not guilt of commission, guilt of silence. Claire may have known more than she realized, or worse, suspected but said nothing. And then there was Agatha Merriweather. She had remained composed, too composed, since the beginning. Her remarks always steered conversation away from uncomfortable questions and toward resolution. She had no financial dependency on Lionel. The trust fund in the will was minor compared to what she already controlled from her late husband's estate. But she had influence, or once did, and her brother's apparent plan to put things right may have threatened more than family, routine. Miss Marple had known women like her, matriarchs of appearance for whom control was not simply desired, but essential. If Lionel had been preparing to expose a deception she helped maintain, it might well have been motive enough. Miss Marple requested a brief word with the housekeeper, Mrs. Embry, who had served the family for over a decade. They met in the narrow corridor just outside the kitchen, where the scent of stewed apples lingered. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple began. "But I wonder, had Mr. Spence received any unusual letters in the days before his death?" Mrs. Embry frowned thoughtfully. "No, miss, not that I saw. He did burn quite a few papers the morning before he died, though. Had me set up the hearth in the study. Said it was old rubbish, no longer relevant." "Did he ever mention what they were?" "No, miss. But he looked relieved. Almost like he'd decided something at last." Miss Marple nodded. "Did you ever see anyone else handle his diary?" "No one but him." "But—" she hesitated. "Yes? Well, about a month ago, I found the study door ajar around midnight. Mr. Miles was inside looking at the bookshelf. He said he was searching for a book on legal history, but the way he jumped when I called his name, well, it didn't sit right." "Did you see what he touched?" "No, miss. But he left quickly. Didn't take a book with him." Thanking her, Miss Marple turned the detail over in her mind. Miles had claimed he never entered the study outside of conversations. Yet someone had known where Lionel's diaries were kept. Someone had erased his words as he wrote them, night after night. That couldn't have been done in one visit. It required sustained access, a slow poisoning of memory. Someone had to have slipped in repeatedly, altering the future by erasing the past. Later that evening, she sat once more with the previous year's diary, re-examining the final 3 months. The entries grew more cryptic, more coded. Repeated references to the file and the incident. Then in early December, R returns. She denies everything. But I can't believe her anymore. Will destroy the paper. Too dangerous. Miss Marple flipped forward. Near the end of December, have decided to prepare another record, just in case. Must ensure Claire sees it, not Miles, and not A. Not A, not Agatha. The implication could not be clearer. Agatha had been involved in something Lionel had tried to bury, but then changed his mind about. And if he had decided to make a record, it must have been that which he tried to put in the current year's diary. The one someone ensured would remain blank. She rose at once and requested Claire's company in the library. With the door shut, she spoke softly. "Claire, did Lionel ever confide in you about an old family?" "Scandal?" Claire paled. "No, there were whispers long ago. Something about a woman." Miss Marple leaned in. "Did Lionel ever mention someone named Ruth? Or refer to an incident involving a will?" Claire slowly nodded. "Once. He said he'd mishandled something that never should have happened. That he trusted the wrong person." Miss Marple exhaled. "And that person was Agatha." Claire looked stunned. "But why would she—" "Control," Miss Marple said. "I believe Lionel discovered Agatha had manipulated a legal matter, years ago, perhaps even forged or destroyed a document. And now, With time passing and guilt growing, he meant to set it right. That would explain his secrecy, his sudden desire to update the will, and why someone with old secrets, would go to the trouble of destroying every trace of his final thoughts. Claire whispered, "Do you think she killed him?" "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that the motive may not be murder in the traditional sense, but the fear of exposure can be just as lethal. And Lionel may have taken something before he died, something that holds the truth." There was a pause. Then Claire said, "He kept a small notebook in his coat." "Pocket always, he never let it out of his sight." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Then we must find that coat." The motive web was thick now, strands of greed and fear and guilt woven tightly together. But at the center was not only a blank diary, but a hidden truth that someone had been desperate to smother. Miss Marple was close now. The voices had spoken, the lies had twisted themselves into half-truths, and soon the final piece would surface, perhaps from the pocket of a dead man's coat, or from the conscience of someone who could no longer carry the weight. The coat had been hanging in the wardrobe in Lionel Spence's bedroom all along, an unremarkable navy wool with worn cuffs and a faint scent of tobacco and lavender. Miss Marple had requested it quietly from Mrs. Embry, and the housekeeper, without a word, brought it down and laid it across the study table. With her usual precision, Miss Marple searched each pocket carefully. The front compartments contained the expected items: gloves, a handkerchief, a few coins, and an old stub from a train ticket to Winchester. But the inside pocket, stitched slightly tighter than the rest, held something else entirely: a slim leather notebook with a snapped clasp about the size of a checkbook. Miss Marple opened it and found, in Lionel's tidy script, several pages of short-dated entries. But unlike his daily diary, these were concise and pointed. Each entry focused on the same subject. And on the fourth page, that single letter became a name: Ruth Ellingham. Claire, who stood quietly beside her, frowned. "I've never heard of her." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "I suspect few people have, but this confirms it." Ruth was at the center of whatever Lionel felt compelled to correct. She flipped through the remaining pages and found the final entry. "If I die before this is settled, I hold A accountable." She knew. She hid the will. "I cannot prove it, not now, but someone must know the truth. Perhaps Claire, perhaps the boy." She closed the notebook and turned to Claire. "This changes everything. If Lionel believed his sister suppressed a legal will, then there may be another heir, possibly Ruth herself or her child. And if so, Miles's inheritance would no longer stand." Claire's expression shifted slowly from confusion to clarity. "So Agatha had the most to lose." Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Yes, and yet I don't believe she acted alone. Someone had to help her access the diary, someone younger, someone who knew how to erase Lionel's records and stage a scene that made it all seem natural." Superintendent Herrick was summoned immediately. Once the notebook was handed over, his tone shifted. His earlier skepticism vanished, replaced with the certainty of a man who saw a crime laid bare. "Well, that seals it then," he announced to the gathered family that evening. "We now have reason to believe Mr. Spence was trying to expose a forged will, likely concealed by his sister. We'll be questioning her formally tomorrow. As for the notebook, it's being authenticated, but the handwriting matches previous samples." Agatha sat still, lips pressed in a thin line, eyes shining with restrained fury. "This is absurd. I never forged anything. My brother was a proud man. He blamed others rather than admit to poor judgment." Herrick paid no attention. "The estate is frozen until further notice. If what he wrote is true, Then his nephew may not be the rightful heir at all. Miles reacted as expected. Wait, what? You can't do that. I didn't forge anything. No. One's accused you, Herrick replied, though his glance lingered a second too long. But if the original will exists somewhere, we'll find it. Miss Marple, however, remained silent. She watched the room carefully, not the anger, not the protests, but the stillness in Claire's posture, the brief flash in Agatha's eyes, and the one thing no one seemed to acknowledge: the notebook had not been hidden particularly well. If Agatha had been so clever as to erase an entire year's worth of diary entries, would she really leave behind a confession in a coat pocket? It felt too convenient, too perfectly timed. And the final line, perhaps Claire, perhaps the boy. Why mention Claire if he had already intended to reveal the truth to her? It read more like an attempt to connect threads that hadn't truly existed. And the writing, though neat, lacked Lionel's usual phrasing. He often wrote with legal clarity. This was emotional, uncertain, almost theatrical. That night, Miss Marple requested to see the notebook once more. Herrick, believing the case was all but solved, agreed with a shrug. She sat at the small writing desk in her guest room, opened the notebook again, and this time used a magnifying lens. On the final page, just beneath the ink, she noticed the slightest indentation, as if something had been traced rather than written freely. A faint drag on the A, inaccountable. And there, near the spine of the page, a smudge. Too small to be a fingerprint, but a smear of graphite. Someone had copied this entry, carefully, precisely, but not perfectly. The next morning, the newspapers were already buzzing. "Forged will at Rosewell Grange," read one headline. "Dead solicitor leaves family in chaos." Herrick relished the attention, but Miss Marple asked him one quiet question over breakfast. "Tell me, Superintendent, was the notebooks ink-tested?" Herrick paused. "Not yet. The handwriting's been matched. That's sufficient." "But it may not be accurate," she said calmly. "What if the entries were traced from older documents, or forged to throw suspicion elsewhere?" He frowned. "Why would someone do that if they were already guilty?" "Because they're not," she said softly. "Not entirely. I believe someone created this false victory to end the investigation. To give you a culprit, a motive, a crime, so you'd stop looking." Herrick's brow furrowed, but before he could reply, one of the constables entered with a brown envelope. "This just came in, sir. From the postal examiner. Found at the village sorting office. Never delivered." Inside was a torn envelope addressed to Lionel Spence in a shaky hand, postmarked from Yorkshire. Inside was a single page, unsigned. "You never responded to my letter. Ruth is gone, but her son should know. I can't carry this anymore. I told your sister everything 20 years ago." Miss Marple read it twice, then handed it back. "That letter was never meant to be read. It's why someone moved quickly. The timing's too neat. Lionel dies days after this was mailed. His diary is blank. A confession appears overnight. Too many endings all at once." Herrick looked uneasy now. "You think the real culprit's still hiding?" She nodded. "Yes. And they're watching, waiting for you to close the book. But the story's not finished. It's only been rewritten." He stared at her, the early certainty draining from his face. In the silence that followed, the weight of misdirection settled in like fog over Rosewell Grange. Someone had taken the truth and twisted it just enough to frame the wrong shadow. The real criminal had offered the illusion of closure, and now, emboldened by their deception, they were ready to move again, before the truth had a chance to speak. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room, her fingers gently tapping the side of her teacup, though the tea had long since gone cold. The morning paper lay folded on her lap, the bold headline proclaiming scandal and certainty where there was, in truth, only a curated illusion. Superintendent Herrick had left to consult the solicitor, still certain the notebook was the key to unravelling the crime, but Miss Marple felt the story twisting beneath the surface. The note found at the sorting office, unsigned, desperate, had brought a ghost back into the room. Ruth, a name barely spoken, a person unacknowledged, yet somehow everything revolved around her, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep her story from being told. The letter's mention of a son, now grown, echoed in her mind. Lionel's final real diary, the one from last year, had hinted at a concern he dared not voice openly. Too late to change what's done, he had written, but not too late to protect what remains. At the time, Miss Marple had assumed he was referring to Claire. But now another possibility took shape. She found herself walking through the hall toward the study, where the diaries still rested on the shelf. Carefully, she removed the volume from 12 years prior and began paging through it. For most of the year, the entries were uneventful: legal consultations, weather notes, a niece's wedding. But in mid-July, one line stood out. Agatha returned from Yorkshire today. Ruth is gone. Nothing more to be said, she claims. Miss Marple's gaze narrowed. She reached for the following year's volume and opened to July again. Visited Ruth's cottage. No sign of life. Neighbours say she left suddenly with a child. No forwarding address. No police involvement. No official report. Just a quiet disappearance. And Agatha, of all people, had been the last to see her. She returned the books to the shelf and requested a word with Claire, asking her to join her in the garden, where the air was crisp and the roses drooped gently with morning dew. Claire, Miss Marple said, "Did Lionel ever speak of Yorkshire?" Claire thought for a moment. Once or twice. He had a small property there, didn't he? Something inherited. Yes. He visited often many years ago. I believe it's where he met Ruth. Claire's brow furrowed. Do you think they were involved? I think he may have had a son, Miss Marple said quietly. Claire blinked. But that would change everything. The will, yes, which is why I believe someone ensured the son would never be found. Claire wrapped her arms around herself. Agatha, it has to be. Perhaps, but she may not be the only one. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the study to re-examine the envelope from the sorting office. The postmark was from a small village in Yorkshire, the handwriting unsteady. She jotted down the return address, and after a brief conversation with Herrick, who was by now reluctantly listening to her again, sent a constable to investigate. While they waited for news, Miss Marple focused on another thread that had been quietly tugging at her attention. Miles. He had insisted he knew nothing of Lionel's past, had no involvement in the family's affairs beyond his visits and chats. Yet when the coat was discovered, it was Miles who looked most alarmed, not Agatha. Miss Marple recalled the late-night incident Mrs. Embry had described, finding him in the study, claiming to be looking for a legal history book. But there were no such books in the area he had searched. What if he had been looking for something else? That evening, she waited until the house was quiet, and then visited the study again. With a candle flickering gently on the table, she examined the underside of Lionel's writing desk. Her hand ran along the smooth wood, until her fingers found something rough. A thin strip of tape held a folded paper flat against the wood. She peeled it free. It was a photograph, black and white, creased, bold, a woman holding a baby, both squinting in the sunlight. On the back was written, Ruth, May 1957. Not only was it confirmation, it was proof of intent. Lionel had preserved this memory where no one else would find it. She tucked it safely into her notebook and returned to her room. The next morning, the constable returned from Yorkshire. The letter had been posted from a man named Harold Creeley. an elderly recluse who had passed away just the week before. A former groundskeeper of Lionel's Yorkshire cottage, he had lived in the same village for decades. His neighbour confirmed that he spoke occasionally of the girl who vanished and the boy who should have been a gentleman. He had no family, no heirs, but in his home they found an old chest filled with unsent letters, most addressed to Lionel Spence. Miss Marple read them carefully. They told a story not of scandal, but of guilt. Harold had watched Ruth grow ill. He'd offered to help. She had refused to go to the doctor, afraid, he said, of being found. After her death, the boy, unnamed in the letters, was taken away by a friend of Ruth's from Leeds. Harold had tried to tell Lionel, but the letters were never answered. Only one was posted. The rest remained unsent. Miss Marple stood before the fire that evening, the photograph in her hand, the letters carefully stacked beside her. The web was at last beginning to take form. The crime at Rosewell Grange was not simply about money. It was about legacy, shame, and concealment. Lionel had tried too late to uncover a buried truth. Someone had stopped him, but not in rage or impulse. This had been methodical, slow, a silencing that began with vanishing ink and ended with a perfectly timed discovery that redirected suspicion. And then it came to her, the final overlooked piece. The letter from Yorkshire had been delayed at the sorting office. But who knew it was coming? Who would feel threatened by a letter Lionel hadn't yet read? Unless someone had known it had been written. She returned to the notebook, the false one, the staged entries. She examined the smudges again. Beneath the lines, almost invisible, was a pressed fragment of the postmark, transferred faintly, accidentally, onto the notebook page itself. Whoever copied the letter had placed it beneath the original envelope while writing. Only one person had held that envelope before it reached Lionel. Miles. She sat back, heart steady now. It was Miles who had intercepted the letter. Miles who panicked. Miles who created the forged notebook to make it look like Agatha had acted alone. And Agatha, calculating as she was, had gone along with it, perhaps even helped erase the diary, believing it would protect the family's name. But it had been Miles all along. The real deception wasn't born in inheritance or vanity. It was fear. The fear of being displaced, not by a rival, but by a name he'd never heard, a brother he never knew existed. The crime hadn't started with death. It had started with a lie 20 years ago, and ended only when the past came knocking, demanding to be known. That evening, Miss Marple sat alone in the library, the photograph of Ruth and her child resting beside a lamp, the soft light casting gentle shadows across the table. She had told no one yet, not Herrick, not Claire, that the final smudge on the notebook matched the envelope from Yorkshire. She needed confirmation first. Miles had been clever, just clever enough to mimic another's voice, to construct a convincing confession, and to misdirect suspicion. But cleverness, Miss Marple knew, had a weakness. It assumed everyone else was slower, and that arrogance could be used against him. She took a small sheet of paper and, in her careful, looping hand, wrote a brief note. Not a forgery, not quite. Just a few words that mimicked the rhythm of Lionel's thoughts. Enough to sound authentic to someone who feared discovery. Then she called for Claire and asked a quiet favour. The note read, Harold's letters confirmed it. He knew where the boy went. I must act before it's too late. I'll leave this in the second diary. If anything happens, someone must see it. Together, they folded it carefully and slid it into the middle of the previous year's diary, one they both knew Miles had never bothered to read. Then, with deliberate casualness, Claire mentioned over dinner how she'd been looking through Lionel's diaries again and found something curious about the July entries. just enough to plant the seed. Miles said nothing at first, but Miss Marple saw the faint tension in his shoulders as he reached for the salt. He didn't ask questions. He didn't show interest. That, to Miss Marple, was more revealing than any outburst. Later that night, she asked Mrs. Embry to keep watch over the library door, not to stop anyone, but to note if anyone entered after midnight. Miss Marple herself waited in the small morning room with the door cracked, hidden from view. The hall clock chimed once, then twice, and just before the third hour, she heard the faint creak of the study door. Footsteps, soft, measured, not a stumble, not a nervous dart, but the steps of someone deliberate. By morning, the false note was gone. Miss Marple said nothing. Instead, she asked Superintendent Herrick to call everyone to the drawing room after breakfast. There, with her usual grace, she laid the photograph on the table and waited for the room to settle. Miles stood near the window. Claire sat beside Agatha, whose face had grown paler with each passing day. "I'm afraid I must speak plainly now," Miss Marple began. "We have spent the past week trying to uncover the truth of Lionel Spence's death. But the truth, as it so often is, has been obscured not by lack of evidence, but by the clever use of it." Herrick cleared his throat. "Are you saying the notebook was a fake?" "I'm saying it was planted, created after Lionel's death, using language he would never use and phrasing he never employed in his real diaries. But more importantly, it referenced things he had no way of knowing at the time, such as a letter that never reached him." She turned to Miles. "You typed that notebook, didn't you? You copied lines from Lionel's past entries, trying to mimic his tone. You had access to the typewriter. You were in the study. And you were the only one who could have intercepted the letter from Harold Creeley at the sorting office." Miles's eyes darkened. "That's absurd. Why would I even know such a letter existed?" "You didn't until you found it in the postal basket in the village. You saw your name nowhere on the envelope, but you recognized the return address. You opened it. You panicked. That letter revealed there was another heir, a son, possibly older than you. And if that were true, everything you expected to inherit, this house, this land, the fortune, it would all disappear." Claire looked at Miles, shocked. "You never told me." Miles glared at her. "Because there was nothing to tell. This is madness." Miss Marple was calm. "Then why did you enter the library last night? Why take the note we left in the diary? You see, Mr. Spence, I knew you'd try to find more, and I knew you'd assume Lionel had left something else behind. That was your mistake. You see, the more you tried to control the narrative, the more visible you became." Herrick stepped forward. "We'll need to search your belongings, now." But Miles took a step back, shaking his head. "This proves nothing. You're basing all this on a theory, on an old photograph, on a guess." Agatha spoke then, her voice brittle. "No, Miles, it's over. I know what you did. I may not have known the full plan, but I helped erase the diary. I thought we were protecting Lionel's reputation. I didn't realize you were trying to destroy someone else's legacy to steal your own." Miles turned on her. "You said he had no other children. You said Ruth was gone." "I believed it," she whispered. "But I didn't check. I didn't want to." Miss Marple nodded gently. "And that's what buried the truth. Not hatred. Not even greed, but fear. Fear of scandal. Fear of being replaced. Lionel tried to put it right in the end, but he ran out of time, and someone else ensured he never had the chance." There was silence then. Not dramatic, not explosive, just the quiet, leaden stillness that followed when all the lies had been emptied from the room. Herrick gave the order. Miles didn't resist. As the constables led him away, he looked not angry, but hollow, as if the lie he had built had become the only thing that made him real. When the room cleared, Miss Marple returned to the photograph on the table. "There's still a boy out. There," she said quietly to Claire. "Now a man, unaware of the history he belongs to." Claire looked at her. "Will you try to find him?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "I think Lionel would have wanted that." And as she folded the photograph and placed it gently into her bag, she knew this case, like so many before it, had not been solved with noise or force, but by listening carefully and noticing how the loudest words always trembled when faced with the truth. The mood at Rosewell Grange shifted in the days following Miles's arrest. The air grew heavier, not with relief, but with the faint tension of unfinished business. Though he had confessed to fabricating the notebook and admitted to tampering with Lionel's study, he remained adamant that he had never intended his uncle to die. "I only meant to confuse things," he'd said under questioning. "To delay. Not this." But Miss Marple knew better. Intent could be a slippery thing, and fear often moved faster than conscience. Still, what troubled her now was not Miles, but the silence that followed his departure. It felt too clean, too sudden. And Miss Marple, who had followed more than her share of lies, knew that silence was rarely honest. She had spent the morning sorting through Lionel's papers, now unsealed by the solicitor. Most were routine, legal files, old contracts, letters from clients. But one folder had been marked in faint pencil, R.E., hold until final decision. Inside was a short legal draft, unsigned, proposing a transfer of trust assets to an unnamed beneficiary, dated just 6 weeks before Lionel's death. It wasn't binding, but it showed intent. That file alone could serve as the first step in formally tracing the missing heir. She slipped it into her handbag, meaning to deliver it to Herrick later that afternoon, and took one final look around the study. The desk was tidier than usual. The fireplace had been swept. The ink bottle was gone, likely submitted for chemical testing, and the diaries had been taken for preservation. Still, the room didn't feel at rest. It felt watched. Miss Marple returned to her guest room to rest before the scheduled visit to the solicitor's office. But when she reached into her handbag to check the document, her fingers met only fabric. The folder was gone. At first she thought perhaps she had left it on the desk by mistake. But a search of the study yielded nothing. She checked the hallway, the guest room, even asked Mrs. Embry if she had moved anything. Nothing. It had vanished. And it hadn't simply been misplaced. Miss Marple never misplaced anything. Someone had taken it. She went to Herrick immediately. He was reviewing correspondence when she arrived, and his expression sharpened when he saw her face. "The draft from the study," she said without preamble. "It's gone. Stolen." Herrick straightened in his chair. "You're certain?" "Entirely. I placed it in my handbag myself." "Now it's gone." He exhaled through his nose. "So, someone's still trying to stop this from moving forward." Miss Marple nodded. "Whoever they are, they're not finished. Miles was a participant, but I don't believe he was the architect. He acted out of panic. But this is planned. This is clean." Herrick stood. "We'll search the house again, quietly." They began with the guest rooms, then the library, then the study. But there was nothing. No torn paper, no folder, not even a trace. Whoever had taken the file hadn't simply hidden it. They had removed it completely. By evening, tension had returned to the household. Claire was subdued, spending most of her time in the rose garden. Agatha, who had barely spoken since Miles's arrest, emerged suddenly during dinner, her demeanor sharp and composed. She commented dryly on the weather, on the solicitor's slowness, on the chaos of family matters becoming public spectacle. But Miss Marple watched her more closely now, not her words, but her movements. The occasional glance toward the sideboard where Lionel kept his keybox, the faint clench of her hands at the mention of Ruth's son. There was guilt there, yes, but also something deeper. Resolve. Later that night, while the rest of the house slept, Miss Marple heard faint steps outside her door. Not the brisk steps of servants or the heavy tread of constables. These were soft, precise. She opened the door silently and followed, her slippers making no sound against the carpet. The steps turned down the corridor and into the study. She waited a few minutes, then crept to the door and peered through the gap. Agatha stood at Lionel's desk, holding a thin object, parchment perhaps, or folded paper. Her expression was unreadable. She opened the fireplace grate and bent down, and for one horrifying moment, Miss Marple thought she meant to burn it. But Agatha hesitated. Her hand trembled. Then she slid the paper into the grate, closed it again, without lighting a match, and left the room. Only when the house had settled again did Miss Marple retrieve it. She found the document nestled between the iron bars, unmarred, still whole. It wasn't the draft. It was something else, a letter dated 15 years earlier, from Lionel, addressed to Ruth. "I can't change what was taken from you, but I'll make sure what's his is protected. I'll find a way, Ruth, even if they never forgive me." Miss Marple stared at the line. They, not she, not Agatha alone. More than one person had known about the child. More than one had conspired to make sure Ruth vanished without consequence. The next morning she visited Herrick again. "We need to go further back," she said. "There's something older beneath all of this. The draft was destroyed or hidden because it linked to something larger, something that never made it into official records. This was never just about Miles's inheritance. It was about silencing a past mistake." Herrick looked grim. "You think Agatha?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, but I don't believe she's the only one. Someone else acted last night. Someone still within reach of the truth." As they returned to the Grange, the post arrived. Among the letters was a brown envelope addressed to Miss Marple, no return name. Inside was a single page, typed, "Stop digging. The past is buried for a reason. Let the dead rest." Miss Marple folded the letter calmly and handed it to Herrick. "Someone's growing nervous," she said. "They're losing control. That's when people become careless." The evidence had vanished, but the desperation it triggered was louder than any confession. And now, for the first time, Miss Marple knew exactly what to listen for, not the facts as they were told, but the silence that tried so hard to keep them from being heard. The warning note sat on the side table, its typed words stark and impersonal, against the linen cover. But it was not fear that Miss Marple felt. It was confirmation. Someone had grown desperate enough to reveal themselves, not in identity, but in intention. It wasn't just a cover-up now. It was a defense. And that meant the real villain hadn't run, hadn't panicked. They were watching, waiting, and preparing for their next move, which meant Miss Marple's next step had to be precise. Any misstep now could close the case permanently, not by resolution, but by silence. She and Superintendent Herrick agreed to keep the warning letter secret. The investigation officially was paused. Miles remained in custody, and most of the village believed the mystery had already been solved. But inside Rosewell Grange, nothing felt closed. Miss Marple noticed Claire keeping to herself, often looking toward the road as if expecting someone to arrive or something to depart. Mrs. Embry, usually steady and composed, dropped a teacup for the first time in 15 years. And Agatha had become quieter still, her words fewer, her eyes distant. That afternoon, she told Miss Marple she was considering returning to her estate in Wiltshire. "I've done all I can here," she said vaguely. "The past is the past." But her timing was suspect, her tone rehearsed. That evening, just as twilight settled and the garden lights began to flicker against the hedges, a scream rang out through the house. It came from Claire's room. Miss Marple and Herrick reached the door together and forced it open. The room was dim, lit only by the slant of fading sunlight. Claire was standing at the far wall, pale and trembling, pointing at her writing desk. On it lay another letter, also typed identical to the one Miss Marple had received, but this one was shorter. "You were warned. Next time someone won't wake up." Claire clutched her arms. "It was there when I came in. I'd only been gone 10 minutes. I don't know who—" Her voice cracked, and Miss Marple placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Herrick called for a search of the house immediately. Doors were locked, grounds combed, servants questioned, but nothing, no one, was found. Whoever had left the note had entered silently, moved with purpose, and disappeared just as quickly. There was no forced entry, no disturbance. The implication was clear. The person responsible wasn't a stranger. They were inside the house, or knew it intimately enough to move unseen, and now they had turned their threats into something sharper. Sartus' household gathered again in the drawing room, the atmosphere brittle with fear. Claire sat closest to the fire, hands still shaking. Agatha remained composed, though she said little, simply folding her hands and stating, "We should all leave. This house isn't safe anymore." But Miss Marple looked past the words and into the stillness behind them. There was no alarm in Agatha's tone, no urgency, only calculation, as if the threat confirmed what she already expected. Later that night, Miss Marple couldn't sleep. She walked the corridors slowly, her steps, soft against the carpet, pausing by the study, then the library, finally stopping at the door to the cellar. She had remembered something peculiar Lionel once wrote in a diary, one from the early 1950s. "Moved the strongbox downstairs. Safer than the study. Must make note in case I forget." At the time, she had thought it referred to financial ledgers. But what if it wasn't that? What if Lionel had hidden the original will or something else from the family, not by misplacing it, but by burying it where no one would think to look? She lit a small lamp and descended the steps alone. The cellar smelled of damp wood and stone. Shelves lined the walls, wine bottles, pickling jars, a few old boxes of estate records. But behind the far shelf, she found a faint outline of wood pressed against the stone. A false panel. She pushed, and it shifted just enough to reveal a small recess. Inside was a strong box, dusty but intact, its hinges rusted but unbroken. She opened it slowly, breath held. Inside were 3 items: a signed letter from Lionel Spence addressed to a solicitor in Leeds, dated just weeks before his death, referencing the name Thomas Ellingham as the intended beneficiary of an asset transfer. A birth certificate, Yorkshire Registry, for Thomas Ellingham, born to Ruth Ellingham in 1957, father's name listed as unrecorded. And finally, a second envelope, unsealed, with one word written in Lionel's hand: "Deliver." She clutched the letter carefully and returned upstairs, setting it on the desk in her room and intending to have it formally submitted in the morning. But before she could rest, a loud knock echoed through the house. Not a scream, not an alarm, just 3 heavy knocks at the front door. Herrick answered. A constable stood there, hat askew, out of breath. "There's been an incident," he said grimly. "A body. Down by the stream near the old train path. Female. It's Mrs. Merriweather." The room turned cold. Miss Marple and Herrick arrived at the scene within the hour. Agatha lay just off the path, her coat muddy, one shoe missing, no obvious wounds, no sign of a struggle, but her handbag was gone, her eyes wide open, the expression frozen in a mix of disbelief and fear. The path was rarely used except by locals. It led nowhere. She had no reason to be there unless someone had asked her to meet, or unless she had discovered something she wasn't supposed to see. Back at the house, Miss Marple returned to her room. The envelope she had set on her desk Deliver was gone. Only a torn scrap of paper remained pressed beneath the lamp. The same typed font. You had one chance to stop. You chose wrong. She stood still, the edges of her vision tightening. It wasn't over. It had never been. The real villain hadn't lost control. They were guiding the pace, watching each move, each misstep, and striking not with panic, but with precision. This wasn't about fear anymore. This was about removing anything or anyone that could speak the truth. The evidence was vanishing, witnesses were dying, and now even the detective was being watched. Miss Marple had solved crimes where the killer ran, where guilt broke people. But this was different. This was a mind that didn't fear justice because it didn't believe justice could reach it, but it would. She'd see to that, even if she was next. The next morning, the air in Rosewell Grange felt brittle, as if the house itself knew something irreversible had occurred. News of Agatha Merriweather's death spread quickly, though few outside the house knew the details. Superintendent Herrick worked quietly, tightening security, interviewing each remaining household member again, though it was clear the real questions remained unspoken. Miss Marple said little throughout the morning. She moved slowly through the house, noting how silence had returned, not out of grief, but as a defense. Claire no longer wandered the gardens. The servants walked with eyes lowered. Even Herrick seemed more measured, his usual bluntness edged with caution. Everyone had seen what had happened when someone came too close to the truth. Miss Marple returned to her room shortly after noon, retracing her steps from the night before. She knew she hadn't imagined it. She had set the envelope down with the documents inside. She had left them there, and now they were gone. Not misplaced, removed, taken. And yet, as she moved her fingers along the edge of the desk, she noticed something strange. A single thin thread of black fabric caught on the bottom drawer's corner. It wasn't hers. It matched no one's. Clothing she had seen. But it was familiar. She picked it up and held it to the light. Then she remembered, weeks ago, during one of Lionel's entries from his final completed diary, he had mentioned a man from the village who came to service. The clock. Old uniform. Odd habit of never removing his gloves. Trusts no one. I don't like him near the study. She hadn't thought much of it then, assuming it was Lionel's usual formality, but now it surfaced in her mind with perfect clarity. The clockmaker. Miss Marple descended to the study and stood in front of the old grandfather clock near the bay window. The face was clean, the hands turning smoothly. Nothing seemed out of place. But then she leaned closer and noticed a faint smudge of grease near the base, fresh, not aged like the rest. She stepped back and turned toward the bookshelves. Lionel's study had always been immaculate. Yet there, tucked slightly too deep into the third shelf, was a small, irregular gap between two volumes. She reached in and pulled at the shelf itself. It shifted slightly, then clicked. Behind it was a hollow cavity, just large enough to conceal a bundle of papers, or, Miss Marple thought, to remove them quickly if one had reason to. She closed it quietly and stepped back. No need to draw attention yet. That afternoon, Herrick summoned her to the drawing room, his expression troubled. "No fingerprints on the note," he said. "Just like the last. No clear prints in Agatha's room either. Nothing but faint. Traces of boot marks by the stream, probably hers. Whoever did this is clever. They've left no trace." Miss Marple nodded. "That's because they're not working in panic, Superintendent. They're following a method. One they've used before." Herrick frowned. "What method?" Miss Marple turned away from the window, eyes thoughtful. "Have you noticed what always precedes each key event? A letter, a message, something typed. Always precise, always anonymous. But the same font, the same spacing. No deviations. They don't make mistakes because they've practiced. You think this is someone from outside? I think, she said carefully, it's someone who doesn't belong, but was allowed in. She returned once again to Lionel's old diaries and skimmed through the entries involving household visits, tradesmen, gardeners, delivery men. One name appeared more than once: Mallory. The clockmaker came quarterly, always early, always silent. And in Lionel's last entry mentioning him, he'd written, Mallory was too curious today, asked about the books, said he admired leather-bound spines, watched me too long. Had seemed like idle suspicion. But Lionel wasn't idle. And he had gone so far as to lock important documents in the cellar. Why trust no one, unless someone had already breached that trust? She found Mrs. Embry in the hall and asked, Has Mr. Mallory been by recently? The housekeeper paused. Yes, miss. A week before Mr. Spence died. He came late, though, not like usual, stayed longer. Said the chimes were misaligned. Miss Marple pressed further. Did he go anywhere besides the clock? I think I saw him near the study afterward. But I didn't think anything of it. Miss Marple thanked her and returned to the study once again. This time, she turned her attention to the clock itself. She opened the lower panel where the weights were housed and ran her fingers along the interior wall. One side was clean, the other had faint scratches, horizontal marks inconsistent with the mechanism, and tucked behind the central pendulum was a folded paper. She extracted it slowly. It wasn't the missing draft, but it was something else. An envelope addressed in Lionel's hand, in the event of silence. Inside was a note, handwritten and very short. If this is read after my death, know this was no accident. Someone is coming for the truth I've hidden. Protect her. No name, no location. But the implication was clear. Lionel had feared someone close enough to move freely, unnoticed, yet clever enough to go unseen. And his final instruction wasn't to expose the truth, but to protect the one it belonged to. Miss Marple returned to her room, sat down slowly, and began to sort everything in her mind. The pattern was there: silent visits, careful removals, misleading trails. The deaths had come not out of chaos, but from disruption. Each victim had been one step too close to clarity. Lionel, who began the trail. Miles, who tried to mislead. Agatha, who may have attempted to correct her silence. Claire, warned, but not yet harmed. And her, the outsider, the observer. That was when she saw it. The scrap of thread on the desk, the same color as the fabric used in the uniforms of local tradesmen, but not from a sleeve or a pant leg. Too fine, too neatly woven. It was from a glove. And then, from memory, she recalled something she'd seen the night she followed Agatha into the study. A shadow by the hallway, half seen, standing still, watching. The glint of something polished just before it disappeared. She had thought it a reflection then. But it was the lens of glasses, and now it all fit. Mallory had returned not to fix the clock, but to retrieve what Lionel had hidden. He had already tampered with the study before Lionel's death. He had erased the diary in plain sight over weeks. He had likely typed every message, delivered each note. He had used his routine, his invisibility as a shield. And he was still here, still in the village, still watching. The deaths weren't about revenge or inheritance. They were about ensuring Lionel's heir never appeared. The son of Ruth Ellingham. Because whoever had buried Ruth all those years ago hadn't done it out of fear. They'd done it to prevent Lionel's legacy from changing hands, and Miss Marple realized at last that the villain wasn't ahead because he was fast. He was ahead because no one ever thought to look where the ticking hands pointed. Until now. The realization sat with Miss Marple like a weight on her chest. Not because it was shocking, though it was, but because it explained everything with unbearable clarity. The quiet man in the background, Mallory the clockmaker, had moved through the edges of the household unnoticed, unseen, fixing the time while quietly dismantling the truth. He hadn't forged signatures or shouted threats. He had worked patiently, methodically, never needing to break a window or raise a weapon. All he'd needed was time, and the space that trust offered a man who seemed too dull to fear. She spent the early evening preparing, requesting only that Superintendent Herrick return from the village before dark. She didn't explain why, only that it was urgent and that the moment to act had come. Herrick, now wary of every delay, didn't argue. When he arrived, Miss Marple met him in the library, where the fire had been lit more for comfort than for warmth. She handed him the handwritten letter Lionel had concealed in the clock casing. He read it in silence, jaw tightening with each line. "So he knew," Herrick murmured. "He knew the man would return." Miss Marple nodded. "And he suspected why. But he didn't understand the depth of it. I think we still don't." "Then let's bring him in." "Not yet," she said softly. "First we let him reveal himself. He's not just hiding something. He's trying to complete something." It was nearly 8 when Mallory arrived. Miss Marple had asked for his services, claiming the grandfather clock had begun to stutter. He came promptly, as always, gloved hands neat, coat fastened tightly at the collar, spectacles gleaming faintly in the light of the vestibule. He greeted the butler with a polite nod and entered as though he'd never been gone. In the study, he knelt before the clock, tools out, ticking slowing. Miss Marple entered a moment later and stood silently at the doorway. He didn't acknowledge her, not at first. Then, without turning his head, he said, "You asked for the clock to be checked." "I did," she replied gently. "But I think it's not the clock that's broken." He turned then, his face calm, unreadable. "No? I believe the truth is what you've spent your life keeping aligned, the same way you align gears and pendulums. But that's the thing about truth. It doesn't stay wound forever." Mallory blinked slowly. "You think I've done something?" "I know you have." A long silence followed. Then he stood, slowly, brushing dust from his trousers. "May I ask what exactly you think I've done?" "You erased a man's diary before he could rewrite history. You intercepted a letter that threatened to name the rightful heir. You forged a notebook to point blame. And when someone came too close, you killed them. First Lionel, then Agatha. And you did it all because of a boy." Mallory's eyes didn't flicker, but his mouth tightened just slightly. "You think I did this for money?" "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "Not for money, for protection." The clock behind them ticked evenly, a soft mechanical heartbeat in the quiet room. "You were never the clockmaker," she continued. "That wasn't your trade. You were a steward once, weren't you, in Yorkshire, a caretaker on the estate where Ruth Ellingham lived. You knew her before Lionel ever did." His shoulders shifted. "And if I did, then you would have known what she suffered. She was discarded by her own family after Lionel refused to marry her. She bore his child in silence, lived in fear, and when she died, no one came for the boy. No one but you." Mallory's voice, when it came, was low and steady. He was a child. "No one else would take him. Ruth asked me with her last breath to make sure he had a life. And I did." "You raised him," Miss Marple said. "And when you realized Lionel had finally come to terms with his past, that he meant to name the boy in his will, you didn't see justice. You saw a threat. Because justice is cruel," Mallory said sharply, the edge finally showing. "You think it would have given Thomas anything but shame? A man like Lionel, after decades of silence, decides suddenly he wants to be noble. No. He wanted forgiveness without consequence. And once that letter arrived, once those papers were signed, it wouldn't have mattered what I had done. Thomas would be dragged into the spotlight, ripped from his life, his name buried under the legacy of a man who abandoned him. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. "So you silenced Lionel to protect the boy?" "I silenced him because he wanted to own what he had lost the right to claim. He thought he could fix it with money, with a name on a paper. He didn't understand. I gave Thomas a life. I gave him everything. I won't let him be dismantled so a man like Lionel could die feeling righteous." "You killed Agatha too." Mallory's expression darkened. "She was going to give you the papers. She thought it was her chance at redemption. She thought she could undo what she'd allowed all those years ago, but she didn't understand what that would cost him. I've come too far to let sentiment undo everything." "And me?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Am I part of the cost?" Looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the conflict in his eyes. Not rage, not malice, but the quiet certainty of a man who had long ago decided the world was either cruel or protected by people willing to be worse. "No," he said, after a long pause. "You were never the threat. You were the one who saw it all, too late." But Herrick was already in the room, his revolver drawn, his stance quiet and ready. "I'm afraid you're wrong about that," he said. "She saw it all just in time." Mallory's eyes shifted between them. Then slowly he removed his gloves. His hands were shaking. "I was trying to save him," Miss Marple stepped forward. "And in doing so, you destroyed the very man who finally tried to make it right." The silence that followed was not triumphant. It was still, heavy, and final. Herrick moved forward and placed the cuffs gently on Mallory's wrists, and he did not resist. As he was led from the room, he turned once and said, "Tell him I did it for him." Miss Marple nodded. "I will, and I'll tell him the whole story too." The motive had never been money. It had been love. Warped, desperate and unrelenting love, the kind that protected with the same hands that smothered. Miss Marple returned to the grandfather clock, now ticking evenly again, and for the first time in days, it sounded like the truth had finally caught up with the hour. That night, the wind swept hard across the grounds of Rosewell Grange, carrying with it the cold weight of finality. Mallory had been taken into custody, calm and composed as ever, but beneath that surface, Miss Marple had seen the cracks. He wasn't angry. He was hollow, as if the truth once exposed had stripped him of his only purpose. He had done everything to protect Thomas Ellingham, but he had done it in secret, in shadows, shaping a life built on silence and shielding. And, now that the silence was broken, all that remained was reckoning, but the case wasn't closed. Not yet. There was still the matter of the missing documents, the legal drafts, the cellar letter marked "Deliver," and the birth certificate. Mallory hadn't had them when he was arrested, and though he admitted to removing them, he insisted they weren't destroyed. "They're not mine to destroy," he'd said simply. "I was only keeping them out of sight." Herrick had narrowed his eyes. "Out of sight where?" Mallory had smiled faintly, not mockingly, but with resignation. "Where? The clock stops, but time still lives." Miss Marple knew then that he hadn't spoken metaphorically. Mallory never used metaphor. He was precise, always, and his entire scheme had revolved around one object, the grandfather clock in the study. That evening, long after the constables had departed and the house had settled into a heavy quiet, Miss Marple returned to the study. She dismissed the butler with a kind word and locked the door behind her. She approached the grandfather clock, the one place where all of this had begun. She opened the lower cabinet again and removed the pendulum. Behind it, her fingers traced the small irregular panel where the first letter had been hidden. But there was something more, another latch, one she hadn't seen before. She pressed gently, and the false panel released. Behind it, folded in, oilcloth, were the missing documents, untouched, unburned. She laid them out carefully on the desk. The legal transfer, the letter, the certificate. They were real. Lionel's true intent, preserved in a place only someone like Mallory could trust to keep time and secrets unchanged. It was over. And yet, Miss Marple felt one final unease. If Mallory had believed the act was righteous, if he had taken lives only to shield Thomas, then why hide the documents? Why not destroy them entirely? She held the letter again, scanning Lionel's words. I cannot undo what was taken, but I will not let silence carry my guilt. The guilt had not just been about Ruth. It was about the man he had once trusted, and in that moment she knew Mallory hadn't acted alone. He couldn't have. He knew too much. The layout of the house, the routines, the hiding places, the names of solicitors, the content of letters he never opened. Someone from inside had fed him that knowledge, someone who had access and motive, but lacked the nerve to execute. Mallory had been the hand, but someone else had been the voice. Miss Marple rose from the desk and crossed the hallway to Claire's room. She knocked gently. Claire opened the door, eyes tired, face drawn. Is it over? She asked. Miss Marple stepped inside. I thought it was, but now I believe you're the only one who can answer that. Claire blinked. What do you mean? You knew about Thomas. Claire's expression flickered. I found something in Lionel's papers months ago, and instead of bringing it forward, you passed it on to Mallory. No, I didn't. But she stopped herself. I only asked him to help me understand. He was kind, and he didn't judge me. Miss Marple's voice remained soft. You told him what Lionel was planning. Claire looked down. I was afraid. If Thomas came forward, Miles would lose everything. And even after Miles was arrested, I knew what it would mean. Public scandal, court battles, and for what? A man who'd never asked for any of it? I didn't want to hurt anyone. But you did. Claire's hands trembled at her sides. I never meant for anyone to die. I thought Lionel would listen, that I could persuade him to wait. But then the letter arrived, and I told Mallory because I didn't know what else to do. I thought he'd intercept it, nothing more. You gave him the access, Miss Marple said. You showed him where Lionel kept his diary, where the drafts were hidden, and once he acted, you couldn't undo it. Claire's voice broke. I tried to take the papers back. The night Agatha died, I was going to deliver them to you myself, but I was too late. There was silence in the room. Miss Marple studied her face. You didn't kill anyone. Claire. But you started the fire, Mallory finished. Claire nodded once, slowly. So, what happens now? Before Miss Marple could respond, there was a knock at the door. Superintendent Herrick stood there. He'd heard everything. I think we'll need a statement, he said quietly. But Miss Marple's right. You didn't plan murder. You handed over matches without knowing the house was soaked in oil. Claire sat down on the edge of the bed, face pale. He'll hate me, won't he? Thomas. If he ever finds out. Miss Marple walked to the window and looked out at the dark garden beyond. Perhaps. Or perhaps he'll understand what you couldn't. What? Lionel didn't. That trying to rewrite the past only works when you have the courage to read it first. Later that night, the documents were secured. Herrick began the process of contacting the legal representatives to initiate the restoration of Lionel's true heir. Miss Marple returned to the study once more, not to revisit the scene, but to pause beside the grandfather clock. She listened to the ticking, so constant and unwavering, and thought of all the lives wrapped up in its patient rhythm. Mallory had hidden the truth in the one place he believed it could wait forever. But the truth, like time, had a way of surfacing, tick by tick, minute by minute, until nothing could stop it from being known. The days that followed brought a strange stillness to Rosewell Grange, a quiet that felt less like peace and more like the settling of ash after a long, suffocating fire. The documents had been recovered, the heir confirmed, and the story now moving toward court proceedings and solicitors. Thomas Ellingham, whose name had only existed in Lionel's concealed papers, was being traced through official channels. Superintendent Herrick had arranged a discreet inquiry with the Yorkshire Registry, and word came back that Thomas, now in his mid-30s, lived quietly under another name, unaware of his origin. Miss Marple had agreed not to contact him herself, knowing the first approach would be delicate. It would need the right hands, the right words, but at least now the truth was ready to meet him. The household began to thin. Claire remained quieter than before, her guilt a shadow she would carry for some time. Herrick prepared his final report, confident in its conclusion. Mallory was behind bars. The documents were in custody. The motive was understood. The story was whole. Everything, finally, was in order. Until the letter arrived. Miss Marple received it by hand. Not postmarked, no return address. A plain envelope slipped under her door during the early hours before dawn. She found it on the rug beside her slippers and opened it slowly, sensing at once that it wasn't like the others. The typing was gone. This was handwritten, in a careful, deliberate script. You looked in the right direction, but not deep enough. You uncovered the hands, not the mind. Some people hide behind guilt. Others hide behind goodness. Don't be so certain this story ends in a courtroom. There was no signature. But there was one final line beneath the slant of ink. The photograph in the cellar was a copy. The original is still here. Miss Marple froze. She rose at once, threw a shawl around her shoulders, and made her way to the cellar, lamp in hand. The house was still asleep, the halls dark, but she moved with purpose. The photograph, Ruth and her child, had been discovered weeks ago, tucked behind Lionel's desk drawer, but she remembered now that it hadn't been yellowed as one would expect of a decades-old image. It had been clean. Too clean. She hadn't questioned it then. She'd been focused on the message, not the material. In the cellar, she searched. Again, behind the wine rack, she found a second hollow, much smaller than the first. It had been carved into the stone behind a loose board, sealed crudely with plaster. Her fingers worked it loose, and inside, wrapped in oilskin, was the photograph. The real one. The difference was immediate. This one was aged, the edges curled. But it wasn't just Ruth and the child. There was another figure standing behind her. A man, slight, wearing spectacles, not Mallory, Claire's father. Miss Marple stared at the face. She remembered him vaguely, Harold Underwood, a quiet man who died young, but she remembered the timeline. Ruth had vanished the same year Harold passed, and suddenly things shifted. She brought the photo to Herrick without delay. He studied it, then frowned. "That's not Mallory." "No," Miss Marple said. "And that's what troubles me. Because this man, Harold Underwood, worked for Lionel briefly in the 1950s. Around the time Ruth lived in the Yorkshire cottage, he managed the estate." Herrick's eyes narrowed. "You think he was the one who—" "No, but I think Claire does." They found Claire in the rose garden, pruning what few flowers still held onto autumn. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and froze as Herrick held out the photograph. Her eyes flicked to it and then to Miss Marple. And she didn't blink. "I see. You knew your father was involved," Miss Marple said quietly. Claire gave a hollow laugh. "He wasn't involved. He was Thomas's father." Herrick blinked. "What?" Claire turned, her voice calm now, almost too calm. "My father met Ruth years before Lionel ever did. She was working as a companion for one of the tenants. He fell in love with her. They were never married, but he swore to protect her, and Then Lionel came. With his charm, his promises. Ruth believed him. She left my father, and when she realized Lionel wouldn't marry her, when she became pregnant, she had nowhere to turn. My father forgave her. He took her in. But by then, she was already sick, and when she died, he buried the truth. He raised the boy quietly. But my father was dying too. I was just a girl. I never knew the full story until I found my father's letters after his death. Miss Marple stepped closer. You let us believe Lionel was the father. Because he was the reason Ruth suffered, the reason my father died angry and broke. Lionel spent his life buying forgiveness, shaping reputations. When I found those documents, when I read that he wanted to claim Thomas as his son, I realized what he was doing. He was taking even that. My father raised Thomas, not for a legacy, but because he loved Ruth, and Lionel wanted to rewrite that, too. Herrick's voice was sharper now. So you gave the information to Mallory? Claire nodded. He had no ties to any of it. He was just a man who owed my father a favor. They knew each other. Mallory worked on the estate too. He remembered Ruth. And when I told him what Lionel was doing, he didn't hesitate. He knew what would happen if Thomas was dragged into this, named as Lionel's heir. The whole lie would become his truth. Miss Marple's eyes were heavy. So the murder wasn't just about shielding a boy, it was about preserving a legacy that wasn't Lionel's to begin with. Yes, Claire whispered. You thought Mallory was protecting Lionel's son, but he wasn't. He was protecting my father's. There was a silence then, vast and slow. Herrick sighed, looking down at the photo once more. So what do we do with this? Miss Marple answered first. We tell the truth, as much as the world can bear. Thomas was never Lionel's. That doesn't change the law, perhaps, but it changes the story. Claire looked away. He'll never know either way, and maybe that's better. Miss Marple shook her head. He deserves to know who loved him, and who didn't. As the wind rustled the roses behind them, Miss Marple turned and walked back to the house. The case was finished, but not as it began. The greatest crime wasn't murder. It was the theft of truth passed from one generation to the next, shaped by fear, silence, and pride. In the end, it wasn't the ticking of a clock that unraveled the mystery. It was the photograph no one dared to frame. The house stood quiet under the weight of resolution. For the first time in weeks, the rooms of Rosewell Grange were free from whispers, footsteps, and the ticking echo of unspoken secrets. Yet the air did not feel cleansed. It felt resigned. The kind of silence that settles not after celebration, but after understanding, when all that was buried has been unearthed, and nothing looks quite the same as it did before. In the study, Miss Marple sat opposite Superintendent Herrick, who had just finished reading the statement Claire had provided the night before. The pages trembled slightly in his hand, though his grip was firm. She's clever, Herrick said after a pause. Far cleverer than she let on. Miss Marple didn't nod or smile. She's also broken. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. Herrick set the paper down. And Mallory, in custody, charged with the murders of Lionel Spence and Agatha Merriweather. The Crown will press for life, but he won't say a word against Claire. He never intended to. Not once. Herrick leaned back. You were right from the beginning. There was something too clean about his confession, like he wanted the blame. He did, she said, because it served his purpose, to protect the legacy Claire asked him to protect. He saw himself as finishing something her father started, and he didn't care if it destroyed him. But Claire knew he would. Yes. Herrick was quiet for a moment more. Then he asked, Do you think Thomas should be told? Miss Marple answered without hesitation. He must, not because of the estate or Lionel or the inheritance, but because the only thing worse than being lied to your whole life is discovering too late that someone thought you couldn't handle the truth. Thomas has been at the center of this story without ever knowing he existed within it. Herrick nodded slowly. You'll write to him? I'll see to it. They both stood, and the room seemed to exhale with them, as if the walls themselves had been waiting for the end. Miss Marple moved through the hall, her steps unhurried, eyes resting on each corner of the house that had once felt so composed. Now, she saw it differently. The same clock in the study, the one that had marked every critical moment, now ticked without weight. The same walls that held generations of reputation had proved to be made of paper once pressed. Later that afternoon, Claire prepared to leave. Her bags were modest, her face bare of makeup, her voice almost hoarse when she spoke. She met Miss Marple in the vestibule, where a driver waited to take her to the station. I suppose I'll never see this place again, Claire said almost to herself. Miss Marple replied quietly, Sometimes that's the only way forward. Claire didn't argue, but she hesitated before stepping out the door. Do you hate me? Miss Marple shook her head. I don't hate people. I understand them. And understanding, I've found, is often more painful. Claire looked away, then back once more. You were the only one who looked long enough to see what I tried to hide. I think a part of me wanted to be caught. I think a part of you wanted to confess, Miss Marple replied. You just needed someone to hear it without looking away. When the car pulled off, Miss Marple returned to the library. On the desk, she placed the original photograph, now preserved in a sleeve, beside a clean sheet of stationery. She began to write the letter that would reach Thomas Ellingham. It would not begin with apologies or explanations. It would begin with a truth. You do not know me, and I do not know you. But I have come to know something about the life you were never told you had. She wrote for some time, slowly, carefully, shaping each sentence as if it were being spoken aloud to someone already listening. And when it was done, she sealed it and placed it in the envelope marked with his name. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. Mallory would face trial. Claire had confessed to her role. The documents were safe, and the estate would pass, legally to its rightful owner, even if that truth was more symbolic than material now. But Miss Marple felt, as she always did at the close of a case, that justice was never about punishment alone. It was about revelation. And what had been revealed here was more than a motive or a murder. It was the fragility of memory and the danger of a past that refused to rest until the living gave it peace. Herrick returned that evening to thank her. There's one thing I still don't understand, he said, as they shared tea by the fire. You knew Mallory wasn't working alone. But how did you know it wasn't just about inheritance? She smiled faintly, setting her teacup down. Because when someone lies for money, they make mistakes. They move quickly, but when someone lies for grief, they move slowly, with care. Almost like they're building something. That's what Mallory was doing. He wasn't hiding a crime, he was building a myth, one that would protect someone else. Only someone with love, misguided love perhaps, does that. Herrick tilted his head. And Claire? She was protecting a story, Miss Marple said softly. One where her father was more than just a quiet man who died forgotten. She built a fiction to shield his memory. Mallory enforced it. And in the end, Lionel, who tried so hard to make amends, was simply one chapter too late. Herrick sighed. You always make it sound more human than legal. Miss Marple folded her hands. Because it always is. That night, she walked the halls of Rosewell Grange one last time, past the drawing room where Lionel's presence still lingered. past the cellar door, where truth had waited in silence, past the grandfather clock, which now ticked not with menace, but with finality. And as she stepped out into the cold evening air, she did not look back, because justice had not escaped. It had simply arrived in the only form it ever truly could, when someone at last was willing to listen. Miss Marple left Rosewell Grange the following morning under a low sky, the kind of sky that promised neither storm nor sun, only a grey hush that suited her thoughts. The house stood behind her with its windows like lidded eyes, watching, but no longer speaking. Everything had been accounted for, the documents filed, the statements made, the estate transitioned to a future it never expected. And yet, as the motorcar eased away down the long gravel drive, a whisper of unease settled just beneath her certainty, like a page turned before the sentence had finished. She did not doubt the outcome. Mallory had confessed, Claire had come clean, and the layers of deceit had been peeled back to reveal something raw and truthful underneath. But the detective's mind never closed so neatly. It drifted still, circling one final detail, the final line of that anonymous letter, the one that arrived unmarked and hand-delivered, the one that said the photograph in the cellar was a copy. The line had led her to the original, the one that confirmed Harold Underwood's place beside Ruth. But why would someone write that? Why draw attention to the existence of the original, unless they wanted her to find it? And who, if not Claire or Mallory, had delivered it? Neither had opportunity. Mallory had already been arrested by then, and Claire had been under watch by Herrick himself. The note wasn't meant as a threat. It was too calm, too knowing. It was a nudge, a prompt from someone else watching from the periphery. Back in Wall, St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple, sat by her fireplace that evening, knitting basket at her side, but her hands still. Her mind turned not on the people she had caught, but the one she hadn't quite seen. There had been a gardener at Rosewell Grange, young, discreet, with quiet boots and slower eyes, or the solicitor's assistant, who visited twice and spoke very little, or perhaps the postman, who had worked the village routes long enough to blend into any corner. Someone had been watching the watchers. She returned to her writing desk and opened her notebook, flipping back through the case's earliest notes. Lionel's routines, Ruth's disappearance, Mallory's employment records, Claire's motives, the names she'd heard in passing, the side characters whose presence had gone unquestioned. At the bottom of one page was a scribbled note, half forgotten, visitor log, housekeeper's ledger, day before Lionel's death. Mr. Alton inquired about bell repairs, not hired. She hadn't thought about it again. Who was Mr. Alton? She hadn't met him. Herrick never mentioned him. The bell system had never been touched. She opened another envelope from her case file, a copy of Lionel's final verified journal entry from the previous year. Saw that man again, the one who looked too closely at the wiring above the library. Door. Asked for his name. Alton, he said, but I don't believe that's his real name. Miss Marple stared at the ink, the dry curl of old suspicion. It hadn't been paranoia. Lionel had sensed it too, someone hovering just outside the crime. Not for inheritance, not for sentiment, for something else. What if the story of Ruth and the estate and Thomas was merely one layer? What if someone else had wanted those secrets uncovered, not for justice but for leverage? She sat back, closed her notebook and gazed into the fire. Such a mystery had been solved, yes, but only as far as justice required. And justice, she knew, had limits. It stopped at confession, at courtroom thresholds, at sentences sealed with gavels. But the truth, it rarely stopped at all. It meandered, redirected, vanished, and returned under new faces. Someone had nudged her toward the deeper truth. Someone had wanted Lionel's legacy to burn, not be mended. Someone still moved through corridors untouched by arrest reports. A week later, she received a parcel from the Yorkshire Village Registrar, a delayed item from a request she had made earlier in the case. Inside was a birth certificate she already had, and one she hadn't expected. A second child registered 6 years before Thomas. Same mother, no father listed. Name, Edith Ruth Ellingham. That name had never come up. Not once. Not in Lionel's letters. Not in the house gossip, not in the diaries. Another child. A sister. Miss Marple felt the stillness of the room turn cold. A sister who had gone unmentioned. A sister who would now be in her 40s. A sister who had likely spent her life being the one forgotten, not protected, not claimed. What if it wasn't Thomas that someone was trying to shield? What if he was only part of the story and Edith was the rest? What if someone had worked quietly, through whispers and warnings, to burn down a legacy not for guilt, but for vengeance? She closed the certificate carefully, placed it in her file, and lit the fire anew. The case of Rosewell Grange was closed, but the mystery, as always, was not.